My name is Todd Beck, and I'm a web seminar producer for ACAMS. Welcome to the ACAMS web seminar sponsored by Verifin, Case Study, Cyber Fraud, the New Financial Crime Wave. We're pleased to have two speakers with us today. I'll introduce Brendan, and Brendan, I'll let you introduce Sean. Brendan Brothers is a co-founder of Verifin. His background is in software development, and he holds a degree in engineering with specialized knowledge in robotics, behavior-based analytics, and probabilistic networks. Since co-founding the company in 2003, he has dealt with almost all aspects of the business, including customer education and training. He has a comprehensive understanding of customer needs and how the Verifin application functions to solve the growing and ever-changing problems faced by financial crime risk management specialists. Brendan is a regular speaker on our webinars, and we're very pleased to have him here again today. Brendan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Todd, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. As Todd mentioned, I'm very pleased and happy to be joined by Sean Lonergan, who is the Manager of Fraud Strategies and Initiatives at RBC Royal Bank here in Canada. And Sean, who's going to be speaking in the second half of our presentation here today, is responsible for the online, mobile, and telephone banking strategies at RBC. Certainly a tremendous amount of experience there at the bank, 14 years at RBC, and prior to this, spending 10 years in IT developing fraud, hopefully anti-fraud systems as opposed to fraud systems. And for those of you that may not be as familiar with RBC, RBC is certainly Canada's largest bank, the 11th largest bank globally, operating not only in Canada but around the world in 46 countries with more than 15 million clients. So the problem of cyber fraud and the emerging trends that we see here, we're looking forward to Sean sharing some of the experience from RBC as part of today's presentation as well. The presentation broken into two components today. I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about cyber fraud and some of the trends that we've seen, and then share with you a couple of examples of some of the more recent incidents of cyber fraud and the ways that these kinds of things are perpetrated. It's really quite different than your bread and butter, check fraud and in-person fraud in the branches. And cyber fraud has really come about because of three ominous trends, and we call those the perfect storm. Data breaches, computer malware, and organized cyber criminals. And I want to touch on each of these individually and just give you a sense of the scope of how all of these things have come together to really create that perfect storm of cyber fraud that we're seeing here today. So let's start off and initially talk about data breaches. And if I was to ask for a show of hands, certainly I bet everybody on the presentation today would put up their hands if they were either a victim or knew a victim of a data breach. This is an infographic that we pulled which shows data breaches from 2004 to the current time. And these are only breaches that have more than 30,000 records compromised that are shown. And of course we have the standards in there like Heartland and TJ Maxx, but even ones that I know that I've been compromised in, for example, the Sony PlayStation one, that was fun for me, Evernote, Living Social, some of these where I'm sure parts of my information were compromised. Data breaches, it's an extremely large problem, and even if you look at it from a statistical perspective, the Open Security Foundation has said that in 2012 there was over 1,600 data breaches. That was a 48% increase over 2011 and averages out to 134 breaches per month. Compare that to what you actually hear about. You hear about these kinds of top-line ones, these ones with the mega breaches where there's millions of records, but this happens all the time, and a lot of it is really under the surface. One of the best quotes I ever saw was the CEO of Identity Theft 911 said that it's no longer a possibility that you'll be attacked, it's become a probability and darn near a certainty. And that's the way I think about it in my mind. In terms of our background in fraud and anti-money laundering, I have sometimes a better sense of this than some of my friends do, and I just say, well, it's just inevitable that your personally identifiable information is out there. The types of this PII that's available through these data breaches really lends themselves to committing particular types of fraud, and these breaches really beget fraud. And that's why I think we've seen this as kind of the first pillar or the first sense of this perfect storm of cybercrime. The massive amount of data that can be breached and the types of personally identifiable information that can be compromised, creates this impetus. So the criminals are relying more and more on this data from the breaches to commit fraud, and if you think about it from Javelin's perspective, they put out a research paper earlier the year that said that more than half of all fraud victims are actually data breach victims. The second trend that we've seen is certainly from a malware perspective, and I know that Sean's going to touch a little bit on this as we go through the presentation today, but malware, again, is one of those things where, if I asked for a show of hands, everybody has heard a story, or everybody's had some kind of instance of this. McAfee, in their malware zoo, has over 128 million samples of malware. 128 million samples of different types of malware in their zoo. Just to show you how much of a problem this is, and how the number of this is really quite staggering. Their threat report from the beginning of 2013 said that malware shows no signs of changing its steady growth, which has risen quite rapidly in the last 2 quarters. So we have the data breaches, we have the malware, and then we have the third rung, which is the organized cyber criminals. And the key word in this sentence is the organized cyber criminals. There's a very marked difference between the type of criminal that we're dealing with now from a cyber fraud perspective as what we might be used to seeing, in the kinds of bread and butter extortions and other kinds of simple frauds from years gone by. And we've talked about this in other ACAMS webinars when I've been joined by, Chris Swecker, who's the former assistant director of the FBI. It's no longer the, typical Russian mob or, organized crime type characters that you see. The organization of the cyber criminals has really come about because of the internet. This radical distribution of labor and the vast ability to recruit skills. It's certainly changed the dynamic of the types of groups that we have to compete against in order to be able to prevent this kind of fraud. And if you think about the types of specializations that actually exist out there in this organized world, this is just kind of a broad strokes definition of 10 specializations that you might have. But, thinking about the folks that actually write the malware and code the programs, to those that distribute and act as vendors, almost in the same way that a marketplace exists in the real world, quote unquote. There are folks that sell this and barter and, distribute these kinds of malwares. There's folks that host these kinds of things, the bulletin boards and all these kinds of chat rooms where these folks can interact and get together. The money mules, I'll show you an example of that in one of our case studies as I go through. But, the folks who actually take the proceeds and really launder the money at the end of the day. There's all these different kinds of specializations and all these different kinds of roles exist out there on the internet. And because of the infrastructure that these cyber criminals have in place, it's very easy just to find these folks and put together a team. The leaders, the same way that the CEO of your financial institution is set with, the strategic vision and the goals and all the kinds of metrics that they want to meet and reach, they have the same kinds of things here from an organized group perspective. And most interesting that I've come across now in the past little while in putting together the research for this presentation is the fact that there are actually cyber schools out there now. So it's not even enough to say that the anonymity on the internet and the types of roles that are out there are part of the problem, but now there are actual cyber schools that bad guys can go to and they can learn the tips and tricks and craft of these kinds of attacks. They have comprehensive course curriculum. They advertise in the underground. Sessions are carried out by Skype, video conferencing to promote interactivity, the same way that you might if you were doing a distance course in university or college. The professors participate in Q&A sessions with students. They actually help with job placement. It's almost like a co-op program for graduates with experienced criminals. And they actually vouch for star students to help them join these underground communities that they might not otherwise be able to get access to. So again, the kinds of sophistication we're seeing are really quite large. And, just kind of to carry on with this, the sample course offerings that you might see in some of these kinds of organizations, the beginner's course, Cybercrime 101, the basics of online financial fraud. Schools of carding, card fraud as one of the largest types of fraud, or probably the largest type of fraud right now in the U.S., has the highest demand. It's a hard course to get into, and it has basic and advanced curriculum. Payment card fraud, where we're looking at different courses per payment card type. different ways that these cards might be used in different fraud scenarios, anonymity and security, both theory and practical, how to erase your digital fingerprints, becoming a mule herder, how to open a mule recruitment business and how to manage that, and even special one-on-one tutorials and consultations, problem-solving sessions. I want to do this. Can you help me? What are the strategies? What are the techniques or tactics that I might use for this particular attack? In the same way that you would register for a college or online course for business or accounting or engineering, these kinds of things exist out there now for cyber criminals as well. And the internet, it was never really designed to try and prevent this. The internet, when it was designed by academics and nerds working in universities who wanted to share research papers and so on. The day that the internet became focused on e-commerce and money was really the day that it changed, and we've started to see these kinds of things crop up now in the underground because that anonymity really allows the fraudsters to take advantage, really allows them to perpetrate their crimes. And there's a number of different ways that these threats come about. If we think about some of the different kinds of cyber fraud threats, the FDIC put out a paper in the middle of 2013 and talked about 6 kinds of areas where they saw the prevalent cyber fraud threats. Certainly the ACH credit and wire fraud, the biggest area, when we see examples of corporate account takeovers and those kinds of things where there's wire transfers and so on. ACH debit fraud, cash outs. I'm going to show you an example of the cash out scenario here in just a minute. Database breaches we talked about just a little while ago, as well as malware. And then we've also got, distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks. And from a DDoS perspective, the worry about this is that, the attack is occurring over here on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the criminals are using that as a backdoor to go in and perpetrate their fraud. Federal Reserve in Atlanta actually released some material on this earlier, and they talked about cyber criminals using these DDoS attacks to actually disguise account takeover attacks. And there was an example that came out of this in California. $900,000 was wired to the bank accounts of a California construction company in one of these attacks. It occurred over the 2012 Christmas holidays. And the DDoS attack actually disabled the bank's website while the money was being transferred out 62 mules. The customer actually couldn't access their account information through the bank to become aware of the activity. So again, using it almost as a cloak or a disguise over the actual cybercrime, the actual wire fraud that was occurring, the DDoS could act as a distraction, really. So all of these kinds of things come together. The organization of the cyber criminals, the data breaches, the malware, these new threats, including the DDoS attacks and so on. All these kinds of things come together and really create that perfect storm, that opportunity for cyber criminals to take advantage of the financial system and steal money. And what I wanted to do as part of today's presentation was actually share with you a couple of, real-life examples of these cyber crimes and show you the level of sophistication that sometimes occurs in these. Because as opposed to, a skimming device at a gas station pump, or as opposed to, a criminal taking a check and washing it or forging it or compromising a signature, the level of sophistication that comes along with these cyber attacks is really quite staggering. The number of players that are involved, the process, the teams that actually perpetrate these kinds of things, you may not even be able to fathom it based on some of these examples. So let me walk you through a first example here. And the first example is an internet fraud ring. And I sometimes call it the alphabet soup example when I talk about it in our presentations, because I'll show you in just a second the cast of characters that are part of this. There's a number of folks. This is a story about an internet fraud ring that comprised of at least 7 individuals that worked together across 3 continents in an effort to steal millions of dollars. And we say at least 7 here because you'll probably never truly know the number of folks who were actually involved in it. But these are the 7 that have been identified through the research and through the charges. And they actually used a number of interconnected crimes to execute their meticulously organized game plan. They used phishing attacks and bogus websites to trick unwitting consumers into giving up online usernames and passwords. So, the kinds of bread and butter simple attacks to be able to kind of pick up on this. And there's 7 individuals, at least the 7 individuals, and we'll just call them A through G for this example. But if you actually do the research, you can actually find the court documents, and you can find the names and all the pertinent information about these folks. But basically what happened was 3 of the characters, A, E, and G, they actually were provided with these stolen identifiers that were caught through these phishing attacks and these bogus websites. So once they had that information, they went to go and start using it. And even as a layer of protection or complexity, when they got the stolen identifiers from one character, well, he had actually gotten them from somebody else. So they're starting to build this extra layer of abstraction or hiding where the information is coming from. Because part of the organization, part of the group was actually responsible for deploying these phishing websites. So think back to the kinds of subspecialties that you might have in one of these criminal organizations. You've got folks who are actually going to take it and try to turn it into cash, but then you've got the kind of the technical folks who are out there doing the phishing websites and the attacks to try and gather or bring together all of this information. So once they had these stolen identifiers, what they actually did was they used these then to make unauthorized withdrawals from victims' accounts. So there was a group of them then that started to do this. And what some of them did was they actually took these stolen identifiers and they used them to create fake driver's license information where they could impersonate the victims actually face-to-face in branch. And others then were used to be able to get access to online accounts. So for example, 3 of the folks within this group here, what they would do is they would log into the online banking account, view the victim's signatures on check images, and then actually take that and forge check withdrawal slips and make fraudulent withdrawals. So you can see the kind of overlap even between the cyber fraud attack, which is collecting and gathering all these kinds of credentials and login type information, and then the first vector of attack that the fraudsters would use with this information is they would actually go into the branches and they would do these kinds of face-to-face type crimes. Well, in a second variation of the scheme, what they ended up doing then is they would actually use these stolen identifiers to gain access to payroll accounts through a payroll processor. And this is now where the big money starts coming into play, because you can only do so much face-to-face within the crime. These folks then use these payroll accounts to add in fake employees to the company's payrolls and cause the paychecks to be issued to those fake employees. And to bring in the mules and so on, then they use these fraudulent payroll amounts through both stolen identifiers and unwitting intermediaries or mules, started to move all of this money around. And through these different kinds of attack vectors, then we start to see the dollars add up. As part of the scheme, more than $300,000 in fraudulent payroll was wired to another entity, impersonated a European woman interested in romantic relationships to dupe mules into wiring proceeds of the scheme overseas. Again, that kind of morphing or combination of, the kinds of typical things that we see with the honey traps and those kinds of things into the cyber fraud. And this group was actually, the ring attempted to obtain $3.5 million from fraudulent withdrawals. And when it was all said and done, at the end of the day, the banks, a couple of banks involved, the processor and a bank and trust, together lost $1.5 million to this fraud ring. So all originated in the original attack through phishing, bogus websites, collecting this kind of information, and taking that and putting it into the fraudulent money-making machine to turn it into cash at the end of the day. And there was a number of criminal charges that were laid because of this. And in summary, we've got one person, A, he was convicted, B and G both pled guilty, and they were awaiting sentencing at the time. E is in custody on unrelated federal charges in Georgia. D was in Nigeria, pending extradition. And C and F are still at large. So getting them, finding them, keeping them, arresting them, it's a challenge, again, because of that anonymity of the Internet. So in one example, you have the bogus website, the online attack, the phishing, all those kinds of things, and then you got the payroll attacks and so on, trying to steal and combine this money together. And the online channel is certainly an easy way for these fraudsters to use the power of the Internet and the anonymity of the Internet to proceed with these attacks. Show you another example, and ACH fraud, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is payroll's newest headache. ACH is great when you want to pay your employees, but the fraud, the exposure that might come along with that is certainly something that we need to be aware of. Online banking through the ACH network has generated this new cybercrime, ACH fraud. And payroll in particular, which uses abundant use of this ACH network for direct deposits and so on, is particularly vulnerable to ACH fraud. In fact, the FBI, they say that this fraud is growing and new victims and new cases are opened every week. And we've seen this ourselves at Verifin with some of the customers that we work with. You know, where fraudsters are getting in, they're compromising payroll accounts, as I described in the first example, and they're trying to insert new payees or change payees and steal funds. We've also got the wire problem. And, you know, if you think about corporate account takeover, this affects your customers. We all know about Patco and some of the others that are here, but these are not insignificant dollar amounts affecting small businesses where the small business sometimes can't survive after these funds have been stolen. We know as well that because of the changing landscape in the U.S. that a lot of times more responsibility is now being put on the financial institution to protect the customer from this. And Patco is the typical example of this. The FDIC earlier in 2013, you know, new types of cyber fraud such as commercial account takeover may result in losses that can exceed the required capital of the financial institution. So the danger is not just to your customer and the reputational harm and the loss that comes to the customer, but the FDIC even warning that some of these kinds of things might result in losses that could damage the financial institution and the security of the financial institution themselves. If you think about some of these kinds of things, you know, the FDIC and the Fed, they've told lenders to stop relying upon simple things like tokens and passwords and cookies and look at layered security, including software that flags unusual behavior to try and pick up on this kind of stuff. And in most cases of high-frequency transfers, Jeffrey Kopchick of the FDIC says that, you know, if banks had taken what we would consider a cursory look at transactions, they would have seen that the money going out the door was completely anomalous. And that's a fairly direct statement at financial institutions to open up your eyes and try to assess these kinds of things as they're occurring. You know, the customer never does a wire transfer to Russia and all of a sudden there's a $100,000 or $200,000 wire transfer to Russia. Maybe we might want to treat that with some degree of risk or suspicion, or at least call the customer to determine what's going on. We'll talk about layers as we go through the remainder of the presentation. I know Sean's got some great information to help present on some of the ways that RBC has used this layered approach. One last example before I turn it over to Sean. I want to talk about one of the more recent cases of this type of cyber fraud, and it was a cash out in New York. And, you know, also known sometimes as a PIN caching or a carding. This is a cyber crime where the organization actually tried to steal $45 million. So quite a bit larger, even more than the example that we just talked about earlier. U.S. Attorney Loretta Lynch, in the place of guns and masks, this cybercrime organization used laptops and the internet. So what actually happened here in this cyber fraud campaign? If you haven't heard about this story, this is the New York case that we're going to talk about here now. And basically what happened is they used sophisticated intrusion techniques to actually hack into the systems of global financial institutions. In this organized group, what they actually did was they stole prepaid debit card data, and I think in a stroke of genius, they actually eliminated the withdrawal limits on the cards. They then took that information and disseminated that stolen card data worldwide, and cashier cells then actually went out and made fraudulent ATM withdrawals across the globe. And specifically in New York, there were 8 defendants and co-conspirators that targeted New York City. And what these guys actually did is they withdrew almost $3 million from ATM machines in New York in less than 24 hours. So again, tying together an element of cybercrime from intrusion and a data breach type perspective, hacking in, getting this information, and then using it to perpetrate fraud using plastic, going from ATM to ATM. And, you know, through the power of the analysis afterwards, this was it shows the route of one of the New York cell members starting on the Upper West Side, making their way down through the park, down through Midtown, and then hooking back up around. 5.5 hours, you can see the number of machines that these folks were actually able to attack. And because this was done at ATMs, this is actually quite funny that you can we've actually got access to the images of these guys that are going through. So you can see here, 4:30 in the afternoon up on Broadway, 5 withdrawals, $4,000. 5:10 moving down 2077 Broadway, 3 withdrawals, 2409. 5:28 further down, 3 withdrawals, 2409. 6:17 another 2409. 6:24 another 2409. So you can see that this, at least we're paying the service charges here. We're taking out our $800 at a time, but at least we're getting our $3 service charge. 6:43 another 2409. 7:31 another 2409. 8:55 another 2409. Same guy. Backpack certainly getting heavier as we continue to go on. 9:24. I'm going to throw in a few more cards. Take out 5621, and then 9:55 again, $4,000 in 4 withdrawals. So literally, plastic in his pocket, walking down, doing these ATM withdrawals, filling up his bag full of cash, and getting to the end of the day. And we talk about the sophistication and the intelligence of some of these cyber criminals. Well, at the end of the day, sometimes you just need the runners to go out and perpetrate the fraud. So, the brains of the operation might be the guys who are out, actually doing the data breach and setting the clearing the withdrawal limits on the cards and, getting all that information. But they got to get it out to the runners. They got to get it out to the guys, in the black jackets and the black hats who are going out there. And when the police were investigating this, they actually seized images from one of the New York cell members' iPhones. And I thought this was really quite funny. Here's the 2 lunatics over here on the left-hand side with a big stack of cash and, cash on the bed, and they're going to go and buy some nice gifts from Gucci and so on for their wives, a Rolex here purchased as well, going to celebrate with a few cold ones, more stacks of cash on top of that. Not really the rocket scientists out doing the running, but certainly the amount of funds that were perpetrated or stolen from this really quite significant. And in the underground lingo, they call these unlimited operations because when they eliminated these withdrawal limits on the cards, the criminals basically had access to virtually unlimited proceeds. And that's really what's quite scary about this because, the bad guys know exactly what they need to do. They go in and they do it. And even so much preparation in the sense that they actually had what we think was a dress rehearsal. And the dress rehearsal, what they did was they simply did only 4,500 transactions, cashed themselves in 20 countries, and they made away with $5 million in ATM withdrawals. And the New York City group here did 750 and withdrew 400,000 in 2.5 hours. And then once they realized that the process, the information, the strategy that they had was good, then they actually did the actual unlimited operation. And this is then where you're seeing 36,000 transactions worldwide, cash yourselves in 24 countries, $40 million in ATM withdrawals, and all of this done in 10 hours. This is where we see that $2.4 million in New York City. So to kind of round this out, since we put these slides together for this presentation, a little bit further research on the outcome of this. 3 folks in that New York cell actually ended up pleading guilty, facing up to 7.5 years in prison, upwards of $250,000 in fines and forfeitures of all the proceeds of the crime. The question becomes, are these kinds of penalties high enough to prevent these kinds of things in the future because of the anonymous nature of these kinds of attacks? The criminals really think it's very easy to do this and get away with this. So it's something certainly to be aware of in the sense that when that crime is perpetrated from a cyber fraud perspective, the outcome and the actions that come out of it can certainly be very different. Where it's the ACH fraud, where it's one of these cash out scenarios, if it's creating fake identities and stolen checks and so on, all of these kinds are linked together. So, in conclusion, from my portion of this, certainly not meant to scare financial institutions and kind of keep you up at night from our perspective. I can imagine that certainly there's a fair amount of that right now out in financial institutions anyhow because of the scope of these kinds of problems. But really the question is how does a financial institution actually prevent this or even protect yourselves against these types of cyber frauds? And if you think about it, the fraudsters really have multiple access points into your institution, whether it's through the different kinds of channels that you offer through mobile or branch or RDC or online or so on, all the different ways that money can be moved around and hidden and whether it's ACH or checks or wires or debit, all these kinds of ways that the fraudsters can move the money around The best recommendation we've seen, and we're going to carry this theme on throughout the second half of the presentation as well, is that really the only way you can prevent these kinds of things is through deploying layers. And Gartner, in their research, one of the quotes we pulled out here for this, you have to deploy layered fraud protection. In particular, fraud prevention systems that provide user or account behavioral profiling and link analysis are the useful tools to put in place for this. So, all is not lost in this war on cyber fraud. The criminals certainly are sophisticated, and the criminals know the ways that they can attack. But through implementing these kinds of layers and taking that one size does not fit all approach, you have a better chance of preventing these kinds of things within your own financial institution. If you have any questions specifically for me, certainly we're encouraging folks to use the chat and QA panel as we go through for some time at the end. But if you want to reach out and ask me a question specifically, I'm more than happy to address any emails that come through. Just email me at brendan.brothers@verafin.com. And if you're interested in more on our approach and how we help financial institutions, I'm more than happy to chat with you about that as well. I'm going to hand it over to Sean now. So Sean, I'm going to make you presenter, and you should be able to take control of the deck. And Sean's going to walk us through some of the kinds of things that they've been seeing at the Royal Bank of Canada and some of the experience that they've seen when it comes to cyber fraud. So Sean, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Great. Thanks, Brendan, and thanks to Todd and ACAMS as well for having us take part in this. It's definitely a very topical theme, and we hopefully can share some of our experiences and kind of learnings that we've had over the years in this space, and hopefully help some of our colleagues out there. So I just wanted to start with talking about how we're structured at RBC, so our fraud management team. And we happen to be in our operations area. I know some other FIs have, it can be whether it's directly in the lines of business or a centralized team in IT or operations. We've kind of got that centralized model. And what that looks like is we've really got four key teams. The national office team, which is the team that I'm a part of. And we ultimately own the losses and have to put in place controls and strategies and initiatives to control losses on those channels. So my area of responsibility, as Brendan pointed out, is for online, mobile, and telephone banking. So with that, we work very closely with our products folks and our channels folks to ensure that initiatives that they're putting out, and whether it be raising limits or new products or new channels in the case of mobile, thankfully we have great partners, and we're at the table with them to ensure that while we're doing this and building out these kind of lower cost channels and convenient channels for the client, that we've got the right controls in place. So that's kind of our main area of focus. And in order to support that, the key things that we need is we heavily rely on analytics, and we'll get a bit more into that area, but we've got a team of analytics guys that are SaaS guys and statisticians that essentially they build all our rules. We create some in-house models. They're really kind of the brains behind the whole operation that allow us to detect fraud and take action on it. So we've got a team dedicated to run analytics. We do have 2 fraud centers. So these are the guys 24/7 working fraud alerts. I know some U.S. banks or worldwide banks might be a little different. We do have a lot of products in Canada that are instantaneous funds transfer, and those aren't just for business to business. We also have some P2P ones. So it is important that we've got these agents kind of on the ground working 24/7 and being able to interject and take action when we see issues and when we put alerts out to them. And then the fourth kind of cog would be our investigations team, and this is when, unfortunately, we've not been able to stop it, and when we see some larger cases, we get our investigations team involved, and this is a lot of ex-law enforcement, and what they do is kind of the deeper investigations. They collect intelligence so that we can feed that back into our detection systems and capabilities, and go after the assets when there are losses. That includes talking with FIs where the funds go, be it foreign FIs through a wire or domestic FIs. They'll work with their counterparts in the other FIs to try to recover the funds when there is an actual loss. And also when it is, if we are able to go through and push for prosecution, they're the ones that would take the lead on that. So that kind of feeds into what we call our fraud value chain. And this is how we envision and how we kind of structure everything within our team. And so on the left there, it starts with, we try to feed in as much intelligence into our processes and into our systems as possible. So that is a number of different inputs. So things like the NCFTA. So for those familiar with it, that provides a lot of valuable information around bad IP addresses, bad payee, mule accounts, this sort of information. Consortium data, largely at this point it's more just Canadian domestic information sharing between some of the FIs. So again, things like bad IPs and just negative information that we can feed into our systems to better be able to detect the fraud. So that's kind of an input into our prevention and detection pieces. So prevention, you can look at it, and the way we kind of do is there's policy side prevention, which can be things like setting limits or requiring tokens or some other device for all transactions or transactions over a certain amount. So there's a number of things, and we tend to not focus on perimeter security in the online and mobile space, although we do have perimeter security, but we try to make it and balance it against client experience, because ultimately we want to make sure our clients are comfortable working through the online channels and mobile channels, and also we want to ensure that we have limits that fit our clients' needs. So what we really try to focus on, and we'll get more into some details, is the detection side. So we do have a number of systems and one kind of core system that's an in-house build that looks at transactional and behavior analysis to determine anomalies and suspicious activity. And at that point, that's where that would feed out as an alert to our centers to work. And again, then it feeds into investigations if it manifests itself into a larger case with that asset recovery and prosecution workflow if it gets to that point. And obviously we try to avoid it from getting to there, but unfortunately it does from time to time. And there's that feedback loop on the bottom that with this intelligence that we gain as we find where the money's going or what new trends we're seeing, we have to ensure we feed that back into our prevention and detection strategies, and ultimately working with our analytics guys to find new rules or new models that we need to look at to identify the fraud. So that is what, again, we call our fraud value chain. I will go through, there's going to be some overlap here with what Brendan talked to, so I'll go quickly through some of this, but basically wanted to give some of our experiences, I guess, with what we're seeing with recent trends. And so the first two, phishing, be it spear phishing, which is kind of directed phishing, so it's targeted towards individuals or an individual. So it's a little more sophisticated, but we still see a ton of phishing in Canada as a whole. I don't think we see quite as much as the UK sees, but it's still a very low-cost attack vector for fraudsters, and ultimately it comes down to ROI for them as much as it does for us. So they're still using this as a pretty effective technique to blast out phishing emails indiscriminately. People oftentimes will send us something saying, I'm not an RBC client and I've received an RBC phishing email. And they don't really care who they're sending it to. It's so cheap and easy to kind of blast it out as widely as possible to have the greatest coverage possible. So again, the intent there is to ultimately compromise credentials. What we're seeing a bit more with phishing and how it ties into the next point around malware is phishing is often now also being used as a means of distribution for malware. So it may be not as the traditional one where they're directing you to a fake site that looks legitimate and asking for your credentials or additional information, but by clicking on the URL itself, that may infect your PC or Mac with malware. So kind of feeds us into that second point. Still see not a lot of the more sophisticated malware with the man in the browser, man in the middle, man in the mobile type of stuff. We've still, in the retail space especially, not seen a lot of that. We've seen some examples for sure. But if I had to say, I would still say our number one issue that we see are compromised credentials. Again, it's tough to tell whether it's phishing as a result of phishing or a result of, say, a keylogger malware. because most malware have that capability where legit client goes to legit site, enters in user ID and password, and because they've got keylogging capabilities, that information then is sent off to these command and control servers where the fraudster gets them. And as Brendan pointed out, it's oftentimes these guys are the harvesters of the information, but they then, through the underground marketplace, will then sell that off to someone who actually uses the credentials. And they look at the different credentials and kind of value them as to what sort of account balances there are in that profile, and is a business profile worth more than a personal? Oftentimes, yes. So it again feeds into that underground economy that Brendan talked a lot about earlier. So feeds again, next point around fraud as a service, I think Brendan touched on it perfectly. So it is, the level of sophistication is just becoming a little scary, but it's just something we need to be aware of, that this isn't rogue, very uber technical people attacking us. There's a full-on fraud as a service out there, so you no longer have to be technically sophisticated or just the traditional stuff that we'd seen more often. Corporate account takeovers, again, Brendan hit on that well, like ACH, these are the areas, if we talk about what keeps us up at night, it's these kind of likely lower volume but higher impact, higher dollar amount sort of instruments to move money. So I know in the States especially, we hear a lot about ACH, and we haven't seen as much in Canada as of yet, but we definitely see that, and we see wire fraud. So again, retail probably is our biggest issue still to a certain extent, but worrying about and understanding this corporate account takeover is something that we're spending more and more time on and worried about as we move forward. Corporate liability shifts, again, Brendan touched on this, so I won't go too much into it. PATCO is a great example. So where traditionally banks felt that it was, and through all the agreements, it was oftentimes any fraud loss would be the responsibility of the business. That's proving time and time again to be not the case, and there is a kind of duty of care that the banks have to take and ensure we have the proper controls in place. We have a little different environment in Canada than in the States from a regulatory perspective. There's not been the as prescriptive, I guess, regulatory kind of procedures put out, but we want to be sure we're ahead of that and make sure that we're doing it anyways, for our clients, and a fraud against our clients is something we want to prevent as much as a fraud against the bank. So just no longer kind of relying on that old kind of adage that it may not be the bank's loss. Hacktivism, nation-state, industrial espionage, and sabotage. So these are, they've been in the news a lot. I'm sure people have heard quite a bit about it, and ties into DDoS and the Al-Qassam group that was kind of running through a number of U.S. banks and a few Canadian banks over the past probably year and a half. So it's now, things are changing a little bit where ultimately the motives are typically money at the root of it, but it's no longer maybe organized crime. There's oftentimes now we're seeing malware being used as a weapon for nation-state stealing of secrets or information, and the same sort of thing where if you could do this industrial espionage and potentially find out information on deals or M&A sort of information that could be highly valuable. It's just something to keep in mind, that as you also, as you protect your clients, ensuring that your enterprise is protected, because there's obviously a lot of valuable assets within that. So just ensuring that don't look at it strictly from a financial perspective or a transactional perspective. There's also a lot of valuable assets within your organization that one should be aware of. So it's that intellectual property. Ransomware, this has, again, been getting a lot of news recently, and the crypto locker is the most prominent one that's out there. And basically what this will do, and it's, again, just a different spin on ways to monetize malware. And this particular malware, what it does is it will lock what they deem to be important and likely important files to you. So it'd be picture files or files that probably have a high level of innate value to you. And what it'll do is you'll get a message saying that this information is now locked. In order to unlock it, you've got to pay right now, I think the going cost is 2 Bitcoins, which is another conversation altogether in kind of virtual currency. But it's, I think, around $830 or $850. It varies a lot. So basically, they're asking you, what they'll do is once you pay them through these means, you'll get a key to decrypt the files that they've encrypted on your machine. So again, the FIs aren't really involved in this piece of it, but it's from a I'm sure all of us have computers, so there's something to be aware of when you're talking overall kind of health of your PC or Mac or whatever device you're using. It's just another vector that's starting to be used more and more often. Market manipulation. So again, at RBC we haven't seen a ton of this, and what we have seen is pretty low value, but this is where you can start to see account takeovers in your online trading platforms. And so what will happen is people will be on both sides of the trade and take over a legitimate client's credentials for their online investment platform and drive up the price of a stock and then sell it at a loss. And on the other side of the transaction, they'll make money, and they usually do it on lowly traded stocks, so that low volume traded stocks, so that they can actually move the price of the stock. So just another area, and same sort of thing where malware or phishing can be at the root of these compromised credentials. So to bring it back to where Brendan was talking on as well, is there is no silver bullet. It'd be great if you could say use this and you'll be fine. It really does come down to what Gartner lays out and kind of this layered security approach. So we'll walk through each level pretty quickly here, and I'll talk about how we've kind of used our experience in these areas. So level 1 is endpoint-centric. So that is putting something on either the client device or giving something to the client. So examples would be tokens, which I'm sure, for whether it be through VPN or through other means you guys have all seen. So with a token, one of the benefits of it is it's something out of band. So your computer could be compromised, but you still have this physical token that has a one-time password. That it's not to say they haven't been broken, because man-in-the-middle sort of browser or attacks where the fraudster is waiting there for you to enter the token and immediately acts on it. So they've still been broken, but they are still a pretty strong control. Some challenges around it is they are costly, and as clients become more sophisticated, they don't want to carry 10 different tokens, or if they bank at multiple FIs. So there's challenges with that, but it is still quite a strong control. There's other technology out there to look at trying to lock down the browser. So be it a standalone browser for your FI alone, there are those type of solutions, or solutions that look for anomalous activity in the browser itself and try to shut that down. So again, a lot of these have proven to be quite successful. There is, in my view, some challenges around, again, the biggest one being adoption. And in the retail space particularly is getting clients to adopt these technologies and download them. And also, we're often told by our clients that they see fraud protection as the bank's job, not so much theirs. They are willing to be partners for sure, but our focus has always been to try to be as transparent to the client as possible from a control perspective, so we don't burden them with control. So not to say that this isn't a strong area. Our area of focus is going to be in a layer or two when we talk through kind of the analytics piece. But there is a lot of good things that you can look at in this level, and it may have different fits, whether it be across retail or in the corporate space. But definitely these have been effective controls. Navigation-centric. So this is looking more at the kind of the session level and weblog analytics. So again, not a ton of solutions in this space, but it's one we're definitely interested in. We haven't done a ton of work in it as of yet, but I think there is value in this, and really it gives you that view into the session that a lot of times more traditional analytics don't have. So right down to the clickstream analysis. So you're able to see how is someone navigating your online banking website. 99.9% of people will navigate it in the same way. They're going to go through, check their balance, go to the payments page, make a bill payment. That sort of activity is usually pretty typical across your client space. So this is looking for anomalies at that level. It can look at the financials as well, but I think the area of promise in this area, from my perspective, is really getting view into that session and almost clickstream activity that is kind of a newer thing. It's been around. I think the UK has really leveraged this fairly well for a number of years, but in our space in Canada, I think it's relatively, I don't know that a lot of people are playing in this space, but I think there's opportunity. And where I see the most opportunity in our shop, at least, is feeding that information into kind of this level 3 and level 4, which is the areas Brendan talked about and what Gartner kind of called out around transactional and behavior monitoring. So regardless of what channel something, in my view, what channel the activity is happening, you as a bank should have some pretty good view into what their activity looks like. So if you focus, and where we tend to focus a lot of our efforts are on, is understanding what is typical for that client. And this is through advanced analytics and being able to look for anomalies. So I think Brendan pointed out, if someone makes a wire to Russia and has never sent a wire to Russia, that should set off some flags if you've got kind of that analytics in place. So a lot of our area of focus today is around level 3 and level 4. Level 4 is the same as 3. It's again looking at transactional, be it non-financial or financial activity on the client level, but 4 talks about looking cross-channel, so not just looking at online, but looking at your contact center. I know what we've seen, it's not cyber fraud necessarily, but what we see a lot is we've got a great contact center, but with the human factor, social engineering is something we still see a lot of, where someone's able to call in and they may fail authentication 10 times, but eventually may get enough information to be able to pass kind of knowledge-based questions. So having a view into that, to see that someone called 10 times into a contact center, and now I'm seeing that they've reset their online banking password, and now I see that they're adding a payee, and now I see they're paying $5,000 when they've never done a transaction over $250. So all these things just give you that better view into what is normal, aka normal, I guess, for that client. Level 5, this is, to me, a little bit of still a developing technology, and it's a really nice to have, and I think there's a ton of value in this going forward. But it is kind of that higher level analytics that look not only at the client, but look at a client's social network. And that's not really referring to the Facebook type thing, although you could use Facebook information. Where we see the first step in it is looking to see, through your data, drawing connections between individuals. So now I know that client A actually interacts pretty closely with client B, so we may want to look at that a little differently based on what that network looks like. And this has been helpful to draw out things like organized crime and those sort of things from our investigators. So I think there's a lot of value in there. Again, if I had to, and again, this is my opinion, but if I had to say where I think your biggest bang for the buck can be, and you probably have a lot of the data already, and where my view would be that you focus would be on kind of those levels 3 and 4, while looking at the other ones. And it comes down to, I guess, what investment dollars you have, but looking across all of these is, I think, what's out there today, and what consultants see as kind of your best approach to protect yourself and your clients. So I know I kind of ran through those pretty quickly, but Brendan, I think, we touched on a lot of the key things that we'd hope to.
Well, definitely. I think one of the things that you mentioned there as we went through as well is that, I guess, the different experience that you see both from your retail perspective versus your commercial perspective at the bank. I know that you guys, you look at those slightly differently, right?
Correct, yeah. So we have different control structures across the different platforms. Things like tokens as an example. So we do use tokens, but in the corporate space, that's where we use it, because it's a smaller user group. It makes more sense from a cost perspective. Plus, there's, I think, more user acceptance in that space to use additional devices, be it a token. And we constantly look to say what tokens have been around for a while, what controls should we look at, but we definitely do have a different approach across both platforms, even though they're both online platforms or mobile platforms. I think you can look at your own FI, and I suspect there is, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution across your different online platforms.
No, definitely, and I think you also mentioned that with the sense of, the investments in different levels based upon different customer type as well. I thought the point that you made about level one, the endpoint-centric level, and particularly on the retail side, in terms of trying to drive adoption or get users to actually take that step, one of the things that you've kind of stressed throughout is that the client experience is certainly very important to RBC, and I think it's something that you've mentioned as you went through. I mean, is it your responsibility, in the eyes of your customer, whose responsibility is actually to try and prevent this kind of fraud? And I think, you touched on a little bit that your philosophy at RBC is that you do hold some of the power in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think different geographies, I think, have different experiences in this. In the UK, as an example, my experience through talking with colleagues over there is it's a lot more accepted to have things like card readers, to use chip technology to authenticate in an online space. I think in North America that probably wouldn't be as well accepted. So it's really knowing, I guess. I think it does vary across geographies, but our approach has always tried to be as, again, in the background as possible, so as not to impact client experience. Because we see our role as not just about fraud losses. We look at fraud losses, but at the same time client experience, risk exposure, and costs. So we have to balance across all those, and it's not solely our view that we look at losses. Losses are obviously very important, but they shouldn't be looked at in isolation, is our view.
Todd, I was looking through the questions that came through, and I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to just touch on a couple of the questions in the Q&A section. Sean, one of the ones that I thought came through that might be interesting for you to touch on was there's a question that says, what, if any, adverse effects has the ubiquity of mobile devices had on cyber fraud? And I'd be curious to get your opinion on that.
Sure. So I think I see opportunities and challenges in the space, given the new kind of form factor with mobile. So from a challenges perspective, I think the control infrastructure out there is definitely not as mature as the online space. So be that vendor solutions or even internal controls, because it's a bit of an emerging technology, we're not as familiar with it. So as a result, I think the control infrastructure isn't as mature, which is a risk. I also, with the jailbreaking that occurs out there and the rooting of the phones, it kind of that's starting to become a little more prevalent. And with that, a lot of what are the strong controls on a phone and a device are no longer there, which makes it easier for malware to get onto the mobile. So I think the threats are ultimately still the same, but I think there's a lot of opportunities in the mobile space for us than there are in the online space. So, one of the first big ones being the sensors, the military-grade sensors that are on a lot of these devices now, open up a whole new area of opportunity from a biometrics perspective. So there's the traditional stuff around, you could do retina or fingerprint, but the sensors are such now that, and this is still pretty experimental, but things where we all walk almost, your walk is almost as unique as a fingerprint. So knowing the way that you walk with the device, knowing the way that the pressure that you use when you touch the phone, these things can help us know who's interacting with the phone. So the biometric space, I think, is going to potentially blow up a little bit from a good perspective with the mobile form factor, and also geolocation. The fact that you're carrying this device with you, I think the geolocation information on mobile is stronger than just using geolocation based off of IP address that we do in the online space often. So I think we're going to be better. And again, clients have to feel comfortable with allowing us to use that information, but I think public acceptance will grow in that area, and I think all these things will allow us to be ultimately, I think, in a really good position with mobile as the controls mature.
Well, it's interesting too the way that you say. I mean, regardless of the attack vector, whether it's online or whether it's mobile, I mean, this same kind of layered approach to security still applies, because some of these new kinds of emerging things that might appear in the next year from a biometric perspective really speak to that endpoint-centric. It's just that it's a different channel that the activity is coming through, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Todd, we're just about back up to the top of the hour, so I'm going to hand it back over to you. But before we wrap up, I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon, and certainly want to thank Sean Lonergan, my co-presenter from RBC today, who's brought some great color commentary and experience from the largest financial institution in Canada, and certainly one of the largest ones in the world. We've kept an eye on the Q&A panel as we've gone through here. If there's others that we can answer afterwards, we certainly will try to reach back as best we can. But I want to thank you all for attending this event today, and look forward to future ones with you all.
Thank you, Brendan. Thanks, Sean. Thank you to Verifone for sponsoring today's event. As always is the case, we got, especially with a couple of thousand people on the phone today, or on the call, we got way more questions than we could ever handle during the time. Those questions are always very helpful, though, not just in the context of today's event, but for articles and blog posts and conference speakers and all kinds of stuff coming up. So thank you for those questions. If you have additional questions for today's experts, or if you have suggestions for future web seminars, we hope you'll send those to us. The address is there on the screen. It's training@acams.org.